Okay, so we're going to try to speed run a quick review here of what we've been going over for the past several weeks. So let's go ahead and flip over to our slides. Okay, so what we did on the very first lesson is we talked about how originally you had this proxy death that we were living out, I guess, when you had these animals that were getting sacrificed at the temple. If it's a proxy death, it means it's a proxy atonement. If it's a proxy atonement, you can only really have this representative or proxy relationship with God. You get Christ in the picture, and now what you have is a very real relationship. A real relationship that comes from a real death that Christ really suffered on the cross, which meant real atonement, which allows us to be able to have a real relationship with God through Christ. So, after we went through our first lesson, then what we went through is a second lesson. The second lesson that focused really on the triumphant entry of Christ. So we have the picture of what modern day Jerusalem looks like and some markers that talk about what it used to look like. But the point is that this is where Christ was really accepted and received as the king that we know him as. Prior to this, he was a rabbi, he was a teacher, he was an individual who performed miracles. There were even some who recognized his position as being the Messiah. However, this right here is where we start seeing the mass groupings of individuals actually recognizing him as their savior, as their Messiah, the person who is going to deliver them from some form of bondage. After we got done with this, we moved on to looking at Christ, moving on into the temple complex, where he got angry at the fact that people were doing these seedy practices inside of the temple complex. This was where people weren't just conducting business as usual, but they were conducting, very, very uneven, underhanded business. They were taking advantage of people who just wanted to worship God, and that's all they wanted to do. God found that detestable, and so Christ said, I'm going to purge the temple because you have turned this place that I designed and that I intended to be a place of worship, and you have turned it into a place for thieves and individuals who just want to take advantage of my followers. So, where does that lead us now? This week, that leads us to talking about Christ going full ham on all the Pharisees and the scribes inside of the temple. So as I mentioned in the intro, we're moving on into the fourth lesson in this series. And in this fourth lesson, we're going to be moving to where Christ moves then into the following days after his entry into Jerusalem. And he begins teaching and preaching and sharing some stories. Well, there's this one moment in Matthew 23 where basically he begins calling out all of these bad behaviors of the Pharisees and the scribes. So this right here is where he is very directly calling out what you would refer to as the establishment within the church. There are things here that we begin looking at, and all of a sudden we can apply them directly to what we're talking about today. So as I was looking for, different pictures, obviously I've had a graphic or a diagram for every single week. I was looking and I found this right here that I really liked. That kind of summarized this entire chapter into this one phrase, don't be that guy. And that right there really is a very good way of summarizing what this entire chapter is all about. It's looking at how individuals at the time that were viewed as authorities and people who were in charge or at least role models, spiritual role models, acted and saying, don't be that guy. And the message to us today is the exact same message. Don't be that guy. Well, what kind of guy are we talking about? Well, there are several different things that are brought up in here, and I'm only going to touch on 4 of them that we end up seeing. But there are 4 of them that I think are probably the most poignant for us in this day and age, and things that I think are pretty common to a lot of our experiences within the modern church. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing that we see is that the Pharisees were not really teaching the wrong thing, and I think that sometimes is a misconception that people end up having. Maybe not explicitly, but they end up kind of looking at these Pharisees and they picture these almost like Disney evil characters, like wringing their hands in the shadows, saying evil, horrible things. Well, that's not really the case. The Pharisees actually said things that were very correct because, you see, they understood the scriptures. These were people who fashioned themselves as teachers, as preachers, as people who were the experts in the law. And so because of that, they were actually very good at knowing what the law was. They said the correct thing. The problem was not in what they said, it was in what they did. And this becomes something that's very important to us as well, because, a lot of times people end up kind of almost deifying different religious individuals. I can't tell you how many times I've seen individuals who have left a church or left a congregation simply because something happened to a preacher. A certain preacher was either wronged or did some wrong. And because their faith was actually in the preacher and not necessarily in the God the preacher was talking about, all of a sudden they fell away. Well, a very similar thing was kind of happening in this day and age with the temple, where you had these Pharisees and these scribes who knew everything about the scriptures and knew everything about what they would call the Bible, I guess, in their day and age. But the way they lived was very different. And because of that, it sent very confusing signals and messages to their contemporaries. So here's what we see actually being called out in this chapter 23. The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. Therefore, do whatever they tell you and observe it. So you see, that's the important thing. Christ is even saying, do exactly what the Pharisees say. It's very interesting because we oftentimes look at the Pharisees as again, those evil bad guys. He continues on, but don't do what they do because they don't practice what they teach. So again, we see that it's not about the things that they're saying, it's about the way that they're acting. And there's this very important lesson here that I kind of touched on a second ago. We have to be very careful in our expression and practice of our faith and our religion, not to have faith in the religion itself or the religious preachers themselves, but have faith in the God that those preachers are actually talking about. It can be very easy to get sucked into a dynamic personality or somebody who has great visuals or teaches very passionately, but the focus can't just be on that individual. And this is one of the areas where I don't really have a huge problem with people who are big, massive evangelists. I mean, one of my role models really is, Billy Graham. I mean, just the other day I was listening to a message that he was preaching, and it was something that even today, this recording I think was from the 70s, and you're listening to it today and thinking, man, this thing still hits hard today. I mean, just watching a recording of it. So I have no problem with looking at evangelists, but the point is we have to look through the evangelists at the God that they're actually trying to reflect. If we're too busy focusing on the mirror instead of what the mirror is actually reflecting back at us, then the mirror becomes useless. And in the same way, preachers and teachers can become useless as well if it becomes more about them and less about the image that they're actually reflecting. So let's move on and see what else that Christ talks about in here. Seeking credit for your own piety is a bigger problem than many think. Now, just the way that's worded, you may read it and go, well, yes, of course, that's a big issue. But here's what I mean. So many times, we end up hearing a lot of times people who are volunteers, and they get burnt out, right? It's something where you end up putting all your time and all your effort into a ministry or a service project or something like that, just to have nobody come up and give you a pat on the back or nobody to recognize the sacrifice that you're making. And at a human level, that can be very, very, very demoralizing. So, this is one of those reasons why, as, a congregation, as fellow believers, we really need to go out of our way to go to those people and give them a pat on the back and say, hey, you know what? You're doing a really great thing. Even if we have nothing to do with whatever that ministry is or that team is or that service project is, give people a pat on the back. But this is a good example of where two things can be true at the same time. It can be true that as Christians, we need to be encouraging to those other individuals who are serving and who are leading and who are doing because it can be very emotionally taxing. It's also true that as individuals, we need to be careful that we're not just thriving off of the applause and the pats on the back that we get from others. There's a lot of different churches out there that become very obsessed with kind of the optics of whatever they're doing. I mean, that's kind of one of those things that I'll admit that when it comes to when I was a lot more active, doing regular youth ministry. Obviously, there's no youth ministries going on right now at all, at least face to face due to the virus. But when I was doing more regular things, I even got sucked into a little bit, the whole idea of like, well, how big can this be? Or, how much recognition can we get? And while it wasn't about me specifically per se, it did become very much about the optics of things and getting very obsessed over that. But you see, what we can see Christ talking to the Pharisees and the scribes about here is the fact that It really must be about God. It can't be about our own celebration and our own applause and our own credit. If we're doing that, we're totally missing the point. So you see, it starts sounding a whole lot like the last point we were just making. If it's about the mirror instead of the reflection, then the mirror is useless. Well, in the same way, if we start doing ministry and the only reason why we're doing it is so we can get applause, then what's the point? Because after all, elsewhere in the Bible, what we read is that God demands mercy and not sacrifice. So that's right there what he wants. He wants the heart. He doesn't want the action. And if the action is and the credit we're getting for the action is more important, then God doesn't like need us to do a specific thing. So let's see how he words this when he talks to the Pharisees. He says this in verses 5 and 12. They do everything to be seen by others. They enlarge their phylacteries, there's your big word for the day, and lengthen their tassels. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So what are phylacteries? Well, phylacteries are basically these boxes, and they have these parchments in them with scripture. And you would get these and use them as you are praying. The whole idea there's we won't go too deep into it, but basically there are references, there's instruction in the Old Testament saying that that there are scriptures that you should write on your forehead and write on your hearts anywhere you go. And the Jews would take this and kind of have this very literal interpretation of it, where they would take these scriptures and they would put these scriptures in these boxes, and as they prayed, they would put them attach the boxes to leather straps and wrap around their arm, wrap them around their heads, as kind of a literal interpretation of this. But this helped them to again kind of physically connect to something that God was really doing spiritually to the heart, which is to imprint the scriptures and to make sure the scriptures are always on you. Well, but that being said, this was something that was really done as a demonstration of your devotion, and it's something you would do for the sake of prayer. And what the Pharisees would do is they would take these strips of leather and they'd make theirs just a little bit thicker, and they make their boxes just a little bit bigger. And you see the reason why they were doing that is because they were taking this thing that was intended to be kind of a very private, very intimate observance of your obedience to God. And they were trying to make it all of a sudden a very public thing. They wanted everybody to see their piety. So it almost starts looking an awful lot like today when you have, people who they have to have that picture for the Facebook page. They have to have something that they can put on Instagram. They need to make certain that they have everything either, like produced or put in a glossy brochure or something like that. Sometimes we just do ministry for the sake of ministry. And sometimes that's what's more important. When I think about this, there's a specific individual that I won't call out, but I just sent him an email today. And basically what I did is I thanked him profusely because he had confided a little bit in something that he was doing that was very charitable for another individual that he really didn't know all that well. And what ended up happening is this charity basically kind of got spurned and kind of bounced back at him a little bit in kind of a rough way. And he was only including me into this conversation because initially, to help out with what he was doing, he had asked for a couple things. And in the midst of him telling me that everything had kind of fallen apart, the comment I made to him was that his heart was so admirable in that he doesn't seek congratulations or applause for what he does. He does so many things that people don't ever notice, and all they ever see are kind of the outward appearance of who he is and how he talks and how he acts, and they don't even know how rich of a heart that he has for serving other individuals and living out that servant's heart, and in turn showing Christ to other people. And the fact that he does do that without any expectation of getting any kind of congratulations, really, it cuts to the heart of exactly what Christ was criticizing the Pharisees about right here. Saying that, if you're going to humble yourself before God, those are the individuals that God is going to exalt. So it goes back to a phrase I know I've used in past sermons and messages and whatnot, which is something I got from a music teacher. And that's that when you're performing music as a musician, if all you ever perform for is applause, then that's all you're ever going to get out of it. And I thought that was a very profound thing. Maybe it's just because I was a teenager and I was dramatic, but I thought it was very profound. And that right here is kind of applicable to what's going on right here. If all you're ever doing your ministry for is for the applause and the approval of man, then kind of what Christ is saying right here is that's all you're ever going to get. So let's move on. Let's see another thing that he said. Too many people put their faith in man's church rather than God's church. And I'm talking about you committees. So this is a very interesting point here. And it's an interesting point because I think a lot of times, where faith starts to break down is where all of a sudden, a situation really calls our bluff. Do we trust in ourselves or do we trust in God? This is something that I've been a part of committees. I'm still a part of a committee right now at our church. I'm not really ragging on committees. What I am ragging on is anytime somebody sees something where you're having to rely on the fact that the pastor is your shepherd, or you're having to rely on the fact that you have elders if you're an elder-driven church, or you have to rely on the fact that you have deacons, if you have a deacons board. And then people turn around and say, yeah, I get that that's there, but really I think we need to send this to the blank committee. Here's what's wrong with that, is when you search the Bible, you're going to see several things that are in the Bible that talk about how a church should be led or governed. And there's not a whole lot, but there are a couple things. And it does mention preachers. It mentions deacons. And it mentions elders. You know what it doesn't mention? Committees, teams, task force, like whatever you want to call them. It doesn't mention any of those things. But it does mention some of these other elements. And the reason why I bring that up is because sometimes in our practice and our practice and our observance of church culture, church governance, and even when it comes to decisions that are mostly like business decisions, like budgets and whatnot, sometimes we have this tendency to all of a sudden kind of go, the faith stuff is really fun and all, and I know that's what we're supposed to be doing, but I really think that, so-and-so has a CPA, is a CPA, and he understands money, so maybe we should just do what he says instead of really praying about it. I get that you want to pray, but we should really do what he says because he's a money guy. Sometimes we have to live on faith. If we're going to be something more that's just like more than just like a religiously themed club, we have to live on faith. That right there is something that Christ also gets on the Pharisees about. So let's see what he says. In verses 16 and 19, he says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever takes an oath by the temple, it means nothing. But whoever takes an oath by the gold of the temple is bound by its oath." So let's pause right here before we go to the next verse. So what he's talking about when he says taking an oath by the temple is he's saying individuals who are holding fealty, people who are having their faith and their trust in what the temple represents. The temple being kind of the seat, the earthly throne of God, metaphorically speaking, versus the gold of the temple, which is more of the things that man values. So the idea is, what is it that you actually feel obligated to? Do you feel obligated to the God that the church represents? Or do you feel obligated to the man-made construct of the church and its endowment and all that kind of mess? Which do you actually feel responsible to? If we feel responsible to the endowment and to the structure of the church itself more so than the God it represents, then the church has truly lost its way. So let's read verse 19 here. "Blind people, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift?" And that right there is the key point. Are we actually serving the God that the church represents, or are we serving the church itself? And the phrase that I made during one of my sermons to our church is I just said, if all it comes down to is that we're just kind of a Jesus-themed club or a Jesus-themed community organization, I sat there and I looked at my wife and my baby back there and I just said, because here's the deal. My family, my household, we don't need another club or another community organization. We do need a God desperately. And we're all in that situation. And so because of that, I think that's why you see so many churches floundering today, is because you have so many churches that are very about their church, but maybe they've lost sight of the fact that, most people don't need just a community organization. Everybody needs a God. The church that truly roots itself on a need for a God is living for the right thing. And I think you'll see those churches be on fire, whether their numbers grow or not. I think you'll see them be very on fire and very active and really truly living out their purpose. So there's one wrap up here that we end up seeing. And the wrap up here is actually following all these woe to you, woe to you, woe to you statements. And that's that you see Jesus basically saying that, you know what? If you want your organization, you can have your organization. You want your church, you can have your church. Because my church isn't bound to this organization or to this building or whatever earthly construct it is. That my church is based on individuals who follow me, being Jesus Christ, and who show my image to other people around them. That's where my church is going to be. It's not going to be this organization or that organization or that organization. You see Christ make this point specifically as he's talking about Jerusalem itself. We see in Matthew 23, 37 through 38, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. And it's that very last part right there that becomes really the kicker. That is the mic drop phrase that Christ is using. Because you see what Christ is doing is he is turning around and saying that basically, I don't need your temple. In modern day context, I don't need your church. You know, my church being Bowling Green Baptist Church. I don't need Bowling Green Baptist Church. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to. If Bowling Green Baptist Church burned to the ground tomorrow, then it wouldn't mean that God is any less great. It would mean that God stopped working in this community. You know, if all the churches in our county close their doors, it doesn't mean that Caroline County would not receive the word of God and would not see God working in this area. God doesn't need any particular organization, though he does work through them if they follow him. So this is an important lesson that we all have to take to heart, because it's so easy in our society to fall into this comfortability where we end up just kind of like, you know, getting up on Sundays, going to church, doing Bible study, coming back home, maybe going to a Wednesday night program or Sunday night program, and then going about our daily lives and it being nothing else. It's very easy whenever the church finds itself in a financial situation or really at a crossroads where they have to adapt or change to the times to look at and say, well, you know, I think we just need to plan this out and strategize and come up with a roadmap. If I hear about another roadmap, I'm going to scream. You know, we need to come up with whatever our pathway, strategic vision is for how we're going to move into the future. Maybe the church should just pray about it. Maybe the church should seek where God wants it to go. Maybe the church should see if it feels convicted to move in one direction versus another rather than relying on their own wisdom. That's what Christ was talking about with the temple during his day and age. And what we saw as a result of that was Christ come in and turn over the entire authority of the temple during this Holy Week. When he died on the cross and he rose from the dead, he basically seized control from the temple, all of the religious authority it had, and said, the authority is not yours to dole out. The authority is now mine to freely offer to everybody who follows me. That is what Christ is doing when it comes to his relationship to the church. So, the question for us today, the question for the church today at large and as individual members who make up the church is, are we following a church that lives to propagate its own image, or are we living and striving to mold our churches into something that reflects the image of God, so that it would almost be imperceivable to the outside observer, whether it's Bowling Green Baptist Church, whether it's a First Baptist Church, whether it's the United Methodist Church, whether it's the whatever, and all they would see is Christ. If we're doing the latter, then we're moving in the right direction. We're going in the direction that it seems like God would rather have his church. it's a challenge for all of us because we're all very proud of our affiliations. We're very proud of being a part of our church family, and we like showing that off. We like other people to see that. But the goal for all of us should be for people to be able to see past the frame of the mirror and be able to actually see the thing that the mirror is reflecting. That we as individuals, that the church as a church is reflecting the image of Christ and not just reflecting an image that we would rather have other people see of ourselves. So, as we start moving forward, we have a couple more lessons in this series, and hopefully we will start getting these things out a little bit more actually in sync with the Sundays because of the virus happening and everybody getting stay-at-home orders. We kind of had to go back a few weeks and then move forward, but we're getting back on track, and hopefully you'll join us again for the next couple of lessons. I hope everybody is making their own Easter plans. Just because we're staying in doesn't mean we don't celebrate the resurrection of our Christ. Am I right? So until we meet again, God bless all of you. Thank you for joining me for that last video. I hope that you were able to get something out of it. Hope you're able to enjoy yourselves. As you can tell, I'm probably not like the most professional or well-polished YouTuber out there, or content creator, or whatever phrase you want to use. I'm just trying to put things together that I think people will get something out of. If you did enjoy it, I do appreciate feedback, so please feel free to leave comments or hit the like button or dislike button if you didn't like it. If you want to get some updates whenever I put new things out there, then go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and just to make sure you get those notifications, go ahead and hit the little bell icon, that'll be the subscribe button, and that way you get a little notification whenever we put something new out there. So again, hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to interacting with you, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's on here. And till we meet again, stay safe. God bless.